Mr. Niko Pal, I sincerely appreciate you being here today and being an awesome human being. High five.
Nice. That's the best high five I've ever gotten something for.
Hell yeah, man. Just being you.
Yeah.
So I'm going to attempt to give a brief intro about who you are and what you do, but I want you to jump in and correct anything that I misspeak on or don't give justice to. So sitting across from me is Mr. Niko Pal, head freerunning and parkour coach at Forge Parkour in Portland, Oregon. Longtime free runner and tracer, which you'll explain what that means, and also someone who has extensive knowledge and expertise in holistic biomedicine?
Biomechanics.
Yeah. So we'll explain what that is as well. So yeah, did I catch most of how you kind of introduce yourself to people and how you interact in the world?
Yeah, actually, the one thing that I think is interesting and is one of the topics we'll be talking about today is we don't really use the word free running a lot anymore. Mm-hmm. And so I just call myself the head parkour coach for Forge Parkour. Free running, yeah, it's an interesting term that has managed to sort of weasel its way out of the parkour community. It's interesting.
Awesome. If you could just rotate that and just kind of point it right at your mouth. Yeah. So that actually is the first question that I wanted to ask and talk about, because I'm sure we'll kind of dive into it and explain how it's not a easy black and white type answer. But one of the questions that I had from Instagram when I polled people who follow me or follow the show is, what is the difference between parkour and free running? What is it?
Yeah, so to answer that in some capacity, we have to look at parkour historically. So parkour started in France, and it was originally started amongst this group of friends called the Yamakasi, and that's how they sort of refer to themselves. They were inspired by the natural method, or the Méthode Naturelle by George Herbert. They were heavily influenced by this man named Raymond Bell, who is David Bell's father, and David Bell is oftentimes considered to be the founding father of parkour, but I think it's just sort of how the news sort of propagated everything. The Yamakasi are sort of all one big group. It's just, yeah, David sort of took from his father and brought it into that circle, and then they kind of made it their own thing. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where art do displacement comes from as well, ADD, which is just the art of movement, basically. And that's kind of what parkour is, or what parkour has become. But for the longest time, people had been describing parkour as the efficiency of movement and free running as kind of the expression of movement, where parkour is about getting from point A to point B in the most efficient way possible. Free running is kind of about enjoying that journey. But what sort of happened was in the early 2000s, Sebastian Foucan, one of the Yamakasi, was like, well, I find parkour to be in this current iteration too restricting for me. And so he tried to rebrand it as free running, just so he could also appeal to English speakers more so than just French speakers. So it also was to try and bridge the language barrier a little bit. And then it also just, in terms of how he identified, he found it gave him more expression, more freedom to choose what he was doing. And then we're now at this kind of interesting point in history where there's a lot of politics in parkour. Lots and lots of politics. We've got gymnastics trying to claim our discipline as one of its own. We have a lot of different organizations who are all trying to make names for themselves using parkour. And then there's also people making distinctions between competitive parkour and non-competitive parkour. Competitive parkour being sport parkour and non-competitive parkour being parkour. And so there's just a lot of definitions out there right now. And so I think the better question to be asking when you're talking to somebody about parkour is, what does parkour mean to you? And for a lot of us, it means community. It means discovering of our body. It means finding challenges, overcoming obstacles. And we do that while running, jumping, climbing, vaulting, sometimes flipping, and just finding ways to move our body and explore space. And so that's how I kind of view parkour. And then there's kind of all that muddled history of it all and a lot of individual opinions that come into play. But the way that I see my role, because I do coach parkour, the way that I see my role is I am a facilitator in like somebody's movement journey, and my objective is to try and help direct people into engaging with movement in a way that they feel comfortable with. And we identify that as parkour, but a lot of times that also just means getting people back into their bodies, getting people to play. And while we have a name to put behind it, sometimes it's just movement. And I think that it's important to remember that. We have a lot of names for things, but when it all comes down to it, we're just moving.
Amazing. You know, there's some people who might think that that was a really like comprehensive explanation of it, of the difference and of that question, but there's so many elements of what you just spoke about that we could dive so deep into and make into their own podcast, whether it would be the George Herbert who you were mentioning, and that's a really famous text. What was it called?
I don't speak French, so I'm gonna butcher it, but it's the natural method, basically.
Natural method, yeah. And that was like an inspiring text for so many actually movement disciplines that are out there now, whether it's a lot of the movement teachings that have inspired Ido Portal, the movement teachings that are behind. There's another method, Mike Hardy. It's like an animal style movement, MoveNat.
Okay, MoveNat. Yeah.
That also kind of has some origins in George Herbert's book or George Herbert's work, and yeah, it's come across in my own readings and my own studies of movement. The people that you talked about too, there's a lot of rich history there from where they came from, the environments that they practiced in. ADD, art du déplacement, as you mentioned, which is I guess kind of like one of the original names for what parkour is. It's also a term that holds a lot of, I don't know, there's a lot of like respect behind that word, and I didn't know how important it was to a lot of people until I 2 years ago was in Italy, which is where actually the Art of Motion is going to be this year, which I hope we chat about as well. But I was fortunate enough to link up with a group that was practicing in Rome, and I believe they're one of the biggest like ADD groups in Italy. And I'd have to look up the exact name. I think it's something like Forenzia. But there was a group of about 40 people who came and practiced together in a big open courtyard, and it was open to anybody who wanted to move, anybody who wanted to learn how to do some of the basic movements, or even advanced practitioners who were there to train. Everybody was really welcoming, and something that really stuck out to me too was the way that everybody embraced or said hello to one another, where there was this kind of like inner circle handshake that happened where you, like normally in the United States, you give somebody like, a handshake or maybe like a high five or something like that. But what I realized really quickly was that they were skipping the hand and going to my elbow. So they would grab my elbow and then my hand would grab their elbow. And I later asked somebody, I'm like, hey, like, what is that? Like, why are you guys doing this? And it was explained to me that in ADD, if you're training with someone and you are using elements that incorporate height and being at high places, it's much safer to try and grab someone if they're falling if you reach beyond just their hand and actually go towards their elbow. So I found that very interesting, and it was like a practice that made me feel I was part of the inner circle, which kind of happened just after that one session. How did you get started with parkour and with your practice in movement that kind of like is really focused around parkour?
So I do want to answer that question. However, I want to take a quick step back to comment on what you were just talking about. So one of the like founding principles, one of the things that's really important in ADD is the community, the encouragement of trying to support each other, to try and make sure that everybody is progressing together. It's okay if people are working on their own individual challenges, but the intention is there. We take care of each other, we support each other, we want to see each other succeed, and we are all kind of working together to make that happen. And that's some of the beauty of this kind of a community is you come together, you see these people, and in an instant you're accepted into their community, into their space, into their lives in some cases. I have friends that I've made like in just a single day who are like, yeah, come visit me in my country, I'll house you, I'll let you stay in my home, I'll feed you. And like, this is the kind of community that has been built over time, and that's one of the things that's most special about parkour, ADD, free running, all of these different communities that we've created, is no matter what, we're supportive, we're compassionate, we love each other, and we love our movement. And so that's kind of one of the things that's definitely kept me sticking around in parkour for so long. But in terms of how I got started, I can, as long as I remember, I've been jumping off of staircases. Like, I can remember I went to Da Vinci Arts Middle School in Southwest Portland, and I remember just jumping off the staircase every day. It's like maybe like 8 feet high, you know, a couple like stair lengths, I don't know. But yeah, I just remember catapulting myself off of that like day after day after day. Even in high school when I was at Cleveland, I'd be jumping off those stairs, I'd be trying to jump off of walls, and I just always associated it with ninja stuff. And I remember trying to look up like a ninjutsu studio here in Portland to see if that was like what I was looking for, but it was, yeah, I never really found where I identified with that kind of movement, but I'd always sort of been heading in that direction. Like, I remember trying flips when I was younger. Like, everything about me wanted to be doing parkour. I just didn't have a name for it yet. And so come my senior year in high school, I have a friend who's taking this class called TOK, Theory of Knowledge, which is just a class that basically gets students to realize the like inadequacies of school and to question everything. It's like a critical thinking class, and basically one of the assignments was to step outside of your comfort zone and to go try something you've never done before. And a couple of my friends were going to go do parkour at this gym, and I just happened to tag along like randomly. And like, one of the guys that was driving, he wasn't even my friend. It was just like we had a mutual friend who was going together, and so we all hopped in the car, went to try parkour for the first time, and that was it, man. It was magic. It was exactly what I wanted to be doing. I took a class at this place called Revolution Parkour. It's still out there in Beaverton. Yeah.
They have multiple locations.
Yeah, they've got Beaverton, Tualatin, and Gresham. And yeah, it was my first exposure. Back then it was just the Beaverton gym, and you know, they've gone through a couple of different owners now, but the community is still there for them, and they've got very, very successful classes going on right now. But yeah, so that's kind of my home. And then afterwards, I started joining the outdoor community, which has, you know, had its ebb and flow for us here. But the people at the time, like Joey Adrian, who is, matter of fact, one of the best in the world. I can't tell you guys, we got something in our water. We have such amazing athletes here in Portland. We literally have some of the best athletes for parkour and free running coming from our hometown. So I'm really grateful for that. But Joey's a part of our community, and he and I have been teaching and training together for the last like 10 years now. I've been doing parkour 10 years in December, officially. And then, yeah, so it was just this involvement with an outdoor community and giving me some means of expression. I remember parkour's even what like influenced me to head in the direction that I wanted to in school, because I was like, I thought about going into computer science, but I couldn't stand being in front of a computer screen all day. I was like, all right, this is cool, this will make me money, but this won't make me happy. And so that was a really important thing for me to realize. And so I played around. I was like, okay, well, music also makes me happy, so let's see if I could do that. But I felt like if I pursued music as a career, that I would lose my passion for it. And so I decided to step towards parkour then and go, okay, well, I'll study public health and I'll study exercise science. And so that sort of then fed into me as a coach in parkour. And then from here, I've gotten a very fortunate opportunity to be the head coach of Forge Parkour out here in Southeast Portland, and it is unreal. Some days it's like, I can't believe where I am.
And Forge Parkour, for those people who aren't familiar with it, is one of the first gyms that was built from the ground up to be a dedicated parkour like training facility. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's one of those interesting claims. It is definitely one of the first spaces to be built from the ground up with the intention of hosting a parkour gym. However, I don't know if it's the first. I know there's lots of spaces in Europe and outside of our country. It's like parkour is much newer in the Americas than it is in like anywhere else in the world, actually, like the UK, England, all of those places, they've had it around a lot longer than we have. So I would not be surprised if somebody else has the claim to the first, but we are definitely amongst a small group of people who have done such a thing.
And so, you know, it brings up the question that I had when I first heard that there was such thing as a parkour gym, which is, I didn't know this existed. And it makes a lot of sense because it's an environment where you can practice a lot of the fundamental movements in a safer, more progressive manner before trying to explore them in more, I guess, like naturally urban environments where there's, you know, surfaces like concrete and different sorts of dangerous obstacles that you might have to overcome versus the surfaces that are inside the parkour gym, which sometimes are a little bit softer, but oftentimes are just as hard as anything you'd find outside. What is the, I guess, like reasoning behind why like someone would have a parkour gym and how that kind of started? Because ADD and parkour originally started just outside, right, in nature, in the city streets.
So parkour gyms are a blessing and a curse, because there are the people who are all for it, and then there are the people who are against it. This isn't the kind of like state of politics we're in anymore, but there was definitely a period of time where there was just a lot of like toxicity online regarding like people who trained in a gym and people who trained outside, and then the hybrid athletes. There's actually some really fun parodies of different like parkour athlete tropes on this guy named Alex Shower's YouTube channel. He does like how to be a professional free runner, and it's basically just like taking a bunch of silly poses and like yeah, I don't know. It just capitalizes off of the bad things about all sorts of like individual tropes that we have within our community, and they're funny. And so I would recommend checking that out as a peek into a parodied version of parkour.
It'll be in the show notes.
Yeah. But yeah, so the gyms definitely provide an environment that parents are more comfortable sometimes bringing their kids into, but I think that the important thing is to remember that parkour is not necessarily about taking risks. It's about minimizing risks. And so for some people, the gym is a necessary step in that progression, but the intention should always be towards having adaptability. So not being able to just do something in a confined or specific space, but also being able to take those movements and apply them in non-specific settings. And so while I can teach my students how to do a specific movement, if I'm telling them exactly how to do that movement and saying that this is the definitive way of doing this, then I'm limiting their ability to grow outside of, you know, the space or what's being taught. They're not getting the full picture of movement. They're getting what I tell them. And so I think the important thing in a gym-like environment isn't to necessarily always give the answers. It's to, again, like I said earlier, my goal is to guide. It's to facilitate the progression of somebody's movement journey. And different people want different things. So some people want to compete. Some people want to do parkour outside. Some people just want to feel better in their bodies. And so it's just trying to engage with people how they want to be engaged with, and so a space provides another means to do that.
With because we're getting already deep into it, but maybe for people who don't know exactly what parkour looks like, what would be maybe like a popular culture reference to give a visual representation for people who maybe don't know that they've actually seen it, or better understand like what they saw was parkour?
So,
is there any movies or stuntmen?
Oh yeah, for sure. Oh yeah, absolutely. So, in 2003, 007 Casino Royale came out. And with it also came a boom of interest in parkour and free running, because at the beginning of that movie is one of like the historically most like intense chase scenes. Well, not most intense, but like in terms of like parkour, it was kind of just this like historical. This is it. This is a movement now. And you can even look at like a Google search trends for like parkour and free running after that movie, and we get skyrocketed results. And so Casino Royale right at the beginning, there's that.
It's an opening scene with a lot of rooftop chasing.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah. They're in the crowd, they're looking for like somebody. James Bond's on his phone, and then they spot that guy, and they're off on a chase, and he's running elegantly through all of the environment, and James Bond is just busting through walls and doors trying to catch up to him. Eventually he does, because of movie progression, but yeah, the scene was very intense, just him just being graceful and elegant to James Bond's brute force.
So diving over large gaps, diving with a roll, doing plants off of walls to gain height, or just move around more efficiently.
Traversing an urban environment in a non-traditional way. And when I say non-traditional, I just mean like walking in linear patterns, looking for additional routes, or having the ability to find additional routes
while maintaining an efficiency in movement, like you were saying.
I mean, yeah, you could say that. I mean, it doesn't always have to be that way.
Like sometimes there's flair, which is what are the showstoppers for a lot of people when they think of parkour, with people doing flips on concrete, right?
Yeah. And so our movement has become this big conglomerate, and it often gets mixed up with other categories. Like there's another thing called tricking, which has a lot more to do with like ground-based tumbling. And then obviously there's gymnastics, which is, its own beast. It has its own kind of vaulting, its own kind of like hurdles and feats of strength. And so I would say parkour kind of has the tendency to borrow from whoever and whatever it wants. There's definitely a aesthetic difference to the parkour variations of these movements, so they are visually identifiable, but oftentimes it doesn't need to have a distinction made between it. And so that's the thing. I think parkour right now is we were kind of talking about this earlier. It's in its like teenage angst years, where it's trying to kind of identify itself, figure out who it is or who it wants to be, and unfortunately it also has multiple personality disorder, because there's a bunch of different like people who are all trying to pull this identity in their own way to meet their own needs, and at some point it comes down to money over community, and we're kind of seeing just a little bit of that right now, but the community is holding strong against that.
And as I mentioned, when I was in Europe 2 years ago, I stumbled upon a really awesome community of tracers, a parkour community in Rome, which was really surprising, and it was definitely a highlight of the trip. But where are people practicing? Like, I know in the United States it's super popular, but I follow some people who are from Russia, specifically like this one guy, Pasha, who's just
Pasha's the
bonkers.
best. Pasha's the boss.
That's his Instagram handle too, right? Pasha the Boss?
Yep.
Pasha, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you guys don't follow him on Instagram, you want to see just, I don't want to say reckless, but what he's doing has a very high risk factor.
Yeah, so Pasha's movement's actually really interesting within the community, because he has gotten so comfortable with knowing where his body's at in space, and he's just gotten very comfortable setting himself into pretty much positions that most people wouldn't have enough familiarity with to be safe. But that's one of the things about parkour is...
So doing giant jumps with flips into... losing like jumping down 20 feet, 30 feet sometimes. There was a recent video that I saw where he was at a Olympic high dive facility. So a high dive where there was a platform that was about, let's say, 40 feet up, and there was another platform that was 20 feet up. He jumped from the 40-foot platform to the 20-foot platform, and then after he landed on the 20-foot, he did a double flip off of it. And it was just so scary.
Yeah.
But just to give people who are haven't seen it a bit of reference, yeah.
But so those, like, as awesome as it is, those are also sometimes the kinds of clips that are fighting against the completely accurate representation of our community, because people have the tendency to look at the extremes of things. Especially, I feel like right now we're kind of in a like extremist mentality in a lot of ways, and so people are attaching themselves to only like what's happening at the greater ends of things instead of looking at everything else. And so you've got people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s who also practice parkour. We just don't see them as much because they're not entertaining. They don't have that same shock value or that same entertainment value, and so they don't get the same kind of screenplay or screen attention. And that's kind of something that parkour needs a little bit more, is the understanding that roof gaps and like flipping off of things really high off like the ground are parts of parkour, but they're a minority part of parkour. They're just the part that we see the most. And so it's hard. I guess we just need to make parkour more socially reformed in some ways, and then I think we'll have a much better image that people will feel more attached to and understand a little bit better. But right now it's really hard to understand the greater extremes, because even I look at those kinds of things in parkour and I go, that's not really what I do.
Yeah,
I understand that it's great for you, but I don't do parkour that way. Like for like roof gaps and roof jumps and those kinds of things, those involve breaking and entering, those involve breaking the law, and so I personally don't feel like getting arrested. And there are lots of ways to talk yourself out of it or ways not to get caught. It's just, that's where my fear comes into play.
It reminds me so much of like the experiences that I had when I was growing up skateboarding. I used to do a lot of skateboarding, and when I was first starting, we would just go wherever there was a curb that had a little bit of wax on it that we could, grind on. And this was before the widespread like revolution of the internet really happened. Like when I was first skateboarding, like YouTube didn't exist. We started to get cameras that we could film each other on, and that was a lot of fun. But as far as like sharing that, it was going to somebody's house and connecting the camera to the TV and be like, yo, check out this thing I just did. And that was also around the same time that a place that I went to for 2 summers started to really gain more widespread attention, and this was Camp Woodward. Camp Woodward, for anybody who's unfamiliar, is the original location, and that's the one that I went to, was a large camp near an Amish town in Pennsylvania, and the camp had an original focus, which was gymnastics. And it's in a beautiful setting, and they have amazing facilities for gymnastics, so trampolines, foam pits, all sorts of tumbling floors. And Woodward then branched into also including, and that became then their focus, a skateboard camp. So skateboard parks were starting to become like more widespread, and Camp Woodward, with an understanding about how to safely practice a lot of the dangerous like maneuvers and gymnastics that are oftentimes oriented around tumbling, incorporated foam pits for skateboarding for people who wanted to learn how to jump more safely. And then they also created a surface that was not as hard as plywood, not as soft as foam, but was more of like a cushioned plastic that you could land on, and it had a bit of foam underneath, so you could jump and land and roll away, but if you didn't land properly, it still had padding. So it was a progressive way to go from the foam pit to, this was a resi, like a resi material, to then taking it to maybe like a smaller ramp, and you had a cleared, structured way to learn something that without the foam pit, you maybe never would have tried. And it was an amazing experience. And one of the things that I started to see more and more of was the level of progression in skateboarding with a kind of like a linear relationship to the internet, and then also the widespread availability of skate parks. How maneuvers that would take years to learn, kids would start to come into Camp Woodward, and within a week would learn how to do maybe like a 540 on a ramp, which somebody who'd be skateboarding for years maybe would almost learn. And now Camp Woodward has expanded into also having a parkour program, which is really interesting. And that's one of the places that I saw that Joey Adrian, the parkour practitioner here in Portland, like it seems like he teaches out of there. Yeah, legend, I should say. So I just kind of wanted to kind of share that anecdote because with parkour, the level of evolution that even what I remember seeing just a couple years ago to what exists now is really mind-blowing. Like there was an event, a competition recently, the
NAPC's North American Parkour Championship.
And there were a couple athletes from Forge Parkour, where you're the head coach, who just dominated and really changed, raised the bar would be the most like appropriate way to share that. So what were some of the events that happened at NAPC? Yeah, and what are some of the things that the athletes from Forge Parkour are starting to do?
So I do want to talk about this. Can I go back to the Woodward thing real quick?
Please.
Yeah, so Woodward's also really cool in that they bring in different coaches from different disciplines every week, and they pay those coaches, they fly those coaches out there, and they basically, bring them in to train with the kids who are there for camp.
Yeah,
and so
camp.
Yeah, the kids get the opportunity to pretty much train with some of the like best in their sport, or like the up and comers in their sports, and get to progress with them in those camps. But that also reminded me of one of the problems that people have with spaces like parkour gyms. Like both parkour and skateboarding are street sports in their origin. The means to engage with those sports, like in skateboarding you just need a board and some wheels, and parkour you need the shoes on your feet. And so when you start getting into something like Woodward, parkour gyms, and things where people have to pay money to engage with these sports, it almost limits the potential for the full sport to be experienced by everybody. And that's one of the issues that people have with parkour gyms, is the cost of access. What happens to the community? What happens to those who are underprivileged? They can still do parkour outside, but then they don't have the same access necessarily. And that access becomes an inequality in movement, inequality in spaces, and that also is something that needs to be addressed. And there are some organizations in parkour who are working to create more sponsorships and to create more opportunities for kids. But I think that also comes down to us to try and also make outdoor classes available if our movement is something that means a lot to us. And some people do that already.
Yeah. And I know that outdoor classes was one of the things that you still, I don't know if you were still doing that, but I know that it was always a common occurrence to whenever I would meet people who would be practicing parkour, they would always invite me to like, hey, come meet up with us here. I'm a part of a parkour community page on Facebook, and there's always people posting like, I'm training today at Keller Park, come join me. I'm training today at this place, come join me. There's nothing oriented around like, oh, and I'm asking for like a $5 like drop-in donation. So it's always been something that I've understood is kind of core to that central theme of community that you brought up. Yeah, so I think that's really nice that you address that, because it's not inaccessible to people who wanna practice. There's ways that you can, of course, like try to learn some moves off of YouTube, but there's nothing that replicates somebody who's experienced with that with you in person, trying to teach you how to do it more safely. Yeah. But back to NAPC.
Yeah, so back to the NAPC.
NAPC is one of the largest like organizing body competition series in the world, right?
I would say it's hard. They're definitely trying to get to that point, and in a lot of ways they have the production to get there. They've been going on, I think this was NAPC 7, so I think this is the 7th year that they've done it. The format has been changing a lot over the years, and so there's not really a lot of consistency in the competition yet, just because it's still trying to iron out some core details. But as far as like parkour competitions go, and the competitions people look forward to, this is definitely one of them in the year. There used to be a competition called Air Whip. That one's no longer happening.
Air Whip was amazing.
Oh my
I watched
gosh.
the Air Whip live stream, and it was amazing. They built out an entire
stadium
course, in a stadium. I think it was in Finland or Sweden. It was
Sweden.
somewhere in, okay. And Joey Adrian like competed in that, right? Yep. Air whip was amazing. You can definitely still check out the live stream of the last competition on YouTube.
Yeah, you can look up air whip, and then if you go to sportparkourleague.com, you can also find the live stream from the NAPC that just happened a couple weeks ago. Well, I guess just a week now, but yeah. So the NAPC and competitive parkour, sport parkour, is generally split into 3 categories: skill, speed, and style. And so skill focuses on like technical prowess, making movements or combinations of movements as far and cleanly as you can, whereas speed is just about getting through a predetermined course. For the Sport Parkour League, they usually use flags to delineate a path, but they don't dictate any kind of movement requirement. So it'd be red flags on right, yellow flags on the left, and so your body must be on those sides of the flags as you're passing them. And so you get a course, and then you have to sort of practice and figure out the route to take. Whereas in skill, what you need to do is predefined, but it's generally, at the higher levels of movement that, only a few people in the world can do. At the finals for skill, there were 3 challenges that of the 5 finalists, that only 2 of the challenges could be physically completed. And so you see some really bananas things in
what
skills.
were some of those things? Because another element that I see, there's another athlete out of the gym, but 2 athletes out of the gym that really are sharing their progressions on Instagram. Tyler Puderbaugh, and then Max Antle. We'll definitely put their Instagram handles in the show notes. But their skill sets on high bar, I see what they do on high bar, and I don't know why they don't want to just compete in the gymnastics high bar. Because they're doing double flips off of it, they're doing flips on it, all sorts of crazy maneuvers that are what you see literally like Olympic athletes doing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And so
and these are parkour kids that are self-taught pretty much.
Yeah, absolutely. So my favorite is...
And I also coach out of Forge Parkour.
Yes. Yeah. At the NAPCs, there's this guy named Niko Pal. He's from Spokane. Spokane? I don't know. I can't remember where he's from. Right now he's in Missoula, Montana at Unparalleled Movement. But at the competition, he messed up. So he was swinging on a bar, and he meant to do a half turn and turn around, but he didn't get the momentum he needed. And so to generate that momentum, he ended up doing 3 additional half turns, but in doing so, he did a handstand 180 turn on top of the bar, and then another lache 180.
And so a giant, for anybody who's unfamiliar with what that movement is when, imagine you're hanging from a pull-up bar, and you're hanging, but you decide to just start swinging forward and back, and then you end up doing a full swing around the bar. It's not an easy movement, and if you ever went to a gymnastics gym, they would have you start learning that movement over a foam pit.
And you would also practice it with grips on a bar that also has flex and bounce to it, whereas a lot of people who do giants in parkour are doing them on metal bars that don't flex nearly to the same degree as wooden bars.
Yeah, and so the flex gives you a little bit of extra added momentum, not taking away from the difficulty of that.
Oh, absolutely not. I'm just saying that in terms of the difference, you're on a slick metal bar, the technique to do such a thing is just different. And yeah, to see that done at a competition just so casually is really fascinating. And so Max and Tyler are actually style athletes. They don't compete in skill. However, style is a lot about the expression of movement. Usually they're given a starting point, and they're judged on obstacle interaction, execution, difficulty, flow, and overall. Yeah, just overall. And so... you see some of the most incredible things there. In style, they're judged on 2 different lines, and then they have a big trick that they must throw down. And the big trick is something that is a lot of people are upset about in some cases, just because it limits the potential for some athletes to make it all the way through finals. Some people think that big trick needs to be its own competition.
Oh, it's not its own separate division?
No, it's a part of style. And so you get judged on line 1 and line 2, and you could have these 2 beautiful lines. You're just not the kind of person who wants to be throwing double side flip precisions, or these ground changing never done before movements that you sometimes see at these competitions. you would get more athletes who would be willing to try their hand, and then you would also get more athletes who would be wanting to try their hand just at big trick, because there are athletes in the parkour community who don't want to train lines, they just want to do big trick, or they don't want to do big trick, they just train lines. And so competition format definitely still has some more work that needs to be ironed out. It's tough because not everybody wants to commit like a full weekend to competition or has the time to, because parkour doesn't pay a lot of money, especially for their athletes. And so these athletes are taking all of this personal time off to go and do these things for the chance to win a relatively small prize pool.
Mm-hmm. Within parkour, if someone was thinking about it as like a potential career path, like I see some athletes who are like yourself, like coaches, and helping run parkour programs at gyms, which is amazing because it brings parkour in a safe and progressive manner to like young kids or adults. I remember actually the first interaction that I had, the first time I met you was 5 or 6 years ago. I was attending a meetup hosted by my friend Steve Cam, who runs a big fitness website called Nerd Fitness, and we were at Revolution Parkour in Beaverton.
Wait, were you at that?
I was there.
I didn't know you were there for that.
Yeah.
See, I remember meeting you
when
through
we filmed,
Goose. Yeah.
parkour together at Keller. Yeah, it was there that I met you originally, and yeah, so people who are like, okay, like I would love to make parkour my career path. So you could coach, you could of course do that. Then there's the stuntmen, which is scary and dangerous, but really cool because those people get a lot of exposure, you know. So those are the people who you see in commercials, who you see in films, and as far as athletes who are making a living from it, otherwise, like what else could they be doing? So
the most profitable place for a parkour athlete right now would be in social media, as like an influencer of sorts, like getting your follower count up and just, you know,
doing work with brands.
Yeah,
helping
exactly.
advertise.
That's honestly the only sustainable place for a lot of parkour athletes. Like, so Max Antle, one of the guys we talked about, one of the competitors from Portland,
who was the first person to ever do a double
side pre in competition.
So that's a double flip off of a high block, landing on an equally like high block over a concrete floor.
Yeah, I think the platform he started on was 9 feet tall, and the platform he landed on was 3 feet tall, and it was about
don't try this at home.
Yeah, it was about a foot wide, and he stood on top. He does a double side flip, lands on his feet, and then he unfortunately did not stick it in any of his 3 attempts. He got super close on attempt 2.
He always landed on his feet, but he didn't stay onto that.
Ledge. It was never dangerous. It was always just close, and it was the energy in the room at that moment was so alive because something like that had never really been done before, and then to be done in competition at that moment, at that level of consistency, is legendary, and everybody appreciated him for that, and it completely understands that is something that really moved the sport that day.
And you can see the clip on definitely his Instagram, which is like Mantle PK.
Mantle PK.
PK.
But now,
MANTAL.
Here's the best thing about that. We're talking about these athletes and how they're going to sustain themselves. So he ended up getting like second place, which I think came with like, I don't know, a couple $100 Canadian as the prize winnings. And then, you know, Max comes back home and he goes back to his day job working at Target. You know, waking up 5 a.m., going and stocking shelves, and just so that he has the energy to train and focus on his movement. And so a lot of people who choose to do parkour as their like sport or career right now are paving the way for the next generation, because there's no doubt in my mind that parkour has what it takes to go to this next level, to be something like an X Games or Olympic level sport. We just want it done on our terms. We don't want it done through gymnastics or through FIG. It's this whole big, we should talk a little bit about that. FIG, Federation International Gymnastic, or something like that.
Not a lot of money in gymnastics either, unfortunately.
But there's a lot more sponsorship. Especially if you take it to the Olympic level.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting seeing like I'm 32 years old now, and when I was growing up, skateboarding, like, it was, let's say, 20 years ago, and now in 2020 in Tokyo, skateboarding will, for the first time ever, be an Olympic event, which is absolutely amazing. Like, I can't wait to watch it. I think it's so cool that it's been recognized on that level. It's interesting, though, because just because it's the Olympics doesn't mean it's always the highest. No, it is. It is the highest level of competition, because when I was growing up, I was also competing a little bit in freestyle skiing. And it was in the past couple Olympics that freestyle skiing, in the way that I was doing it, so like half pipe and slope style, like, made its way into the Olympics. Snowboarding was really one of the first, what you would consider like action sports, that made it into an Olympic Games when they first started doing it with half pipe, and then they moved it into slope style. And then for the next Winter Olympic Games, it's really exciting. They're going to have a big air competition for the first time. So just how you were saying with parkour, there's the skill, there's the style, and then there's the big trick. If it was all separated in its own way, it would be really exciting to see it on that scale.
Snowboarding also had its start in the X Games, though, didn't it?
Oh, it did, yeah. X Games, the Extreme Games, as they were originally called. I think the first ones were in 1995. Shout out to my friend Kevin May, who was a filmer and producer for the X Games when Tony Hawk did the first 900.
Ooh.
Yeah, which was really tight. I remember that when I was a kid, seeing Tony Hawk do the first ever 900. 2.5 spins on a skateboard. Never been done before until the X Games. And this past X Games this summer, I don't know if it was Tom Shar, but somebody on a skateboard did the first ever 1260. But that was on a big air ramp, which is just so scary. They're going
so
20 feet high.
Do they have to land on their board coming out of the big air trick? Like,
yeah, yeah. Some
That's
of the
so much impact.
The craziest falls in skateboarding have always been on the big air ramp, which were pioneered by a really famous skateboarder by the name of Danny Way, in the early 2000s. Yeah, I have a really distinct memory, actually. When I was at Camp Woodward, they premiered DC Skateboards had a video, their first team video, where they had a section that showcased Danny for the first time ever doing some of the biggest tricks in skateboarding at the time, because people didn't know about this big ramp that he was working on and had developed with DC. I think they were filming it originally in like Mexico or something like that. So that was really cool to see. Got a little derailed and some nostalgia. I had a lot of good memories skateboarding, but it's a thing that you also, as a person who starts to get older and injuries start to take a little bit longer to heal, you start to reevaluate how you want to participate in it. But I loved what you said about with parkour, that it's not a practice that's just for kids. There's people who are 60, 70, 80 years old practicing parkour, but they're still skating too. That's what I'm seeing now as well. Some of the people who were pros when I was a kid and are still skateboarding now, it's really inspiring, but they're just doing it in different ways. Maybe they're skateboarding on bowls, at more flow-oriented skateboarding versus jumping down stairs and sliding down handrails. So it's really cool to see.
So talking about that too, for like the older populations, a lot of it's not jumping off of high things or taking really significant impact. A lot of it is just reestablishing autonomy, or at least introducing what that means, teaching them what falling safely looks like, teaching them or practicing balance with them, reintegrating like things that get their equilibrium back in check, and just getting them again to move. The most important thing that will keep you young throughout your life is to keep moving. It's just once you stop moving, once you stop being active, once you let your body become kind of stagnant, that's when your tissues start to become more stiff and rigid. That's when your ability to be truly in tune with your body and your body in a like sensory space also starts to get diminished, and then you just in some cases, I don't know, stop being as human. I don't think that's the greatest way to think about it, but
I think it is.
Movement is absolutely like quintessential to us having our life. I mean, the only reason why we're here is because of the ability to move, right? Like to move, to adapt to different environments, to different landscapes, to hunt and to search and to climb, jump, run. yeah, we need all of these things, and unfortunately we don't live in a world that encourages like that kind of natural expression of movement or natural like expression of humanism. And so we kind of have to seek it out ourselves. We have to decide that this is something that we want to do. Otherwise, it's going to be really easy to get sucked up into Instagram, Facebook, social media, yada, 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 all these things that are specifically trying to keep you from being active.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. As I mentioned, the first time that I met you was through a class that you helped teach at a parkour gym. For people who are interested in learning about parkour, like what is a class for somebody who's brand new to parkour look like? And, you know, let's say you're an adult. Like, what is that like for someone coming into their first parkour class?
So I would say it depends on the setting. Like, let's take the gym setting, for example. So at Forge, we have two different, like, options. We have an intro to parkour, and then we have a Parkour Fit. The intro to parkour basically has 4 classes that people must take. It's been split up into ukemi, which is the art of falling, where we teach people the main jumping forms, how to land, and then the basics of rolling, and the basics of, like, falling. It's really important, you guys. This one's easy. Don't reach your arms back when you fall, especially don't let your arms get pinned underneath your body as you're falling. It leaves nowhere for your arms to travel. It's a really easy break. Wrist breaks are common not just in parkour but like in life in general. Like, I remember seeing somebody when I was in elementary school just fall straight back and reach their arm out, break their wrist real easy. Wrists are not meant for catching you when you're falling backwards.
So if you are falling, what's I think like a safer way to think about what you should be doing with your hands?
Well, so like the basics depends on how you're falling. So there are lots of different like rules that we would use, but I'd say for most people like who just like stumble backwards because they're like walking backwards and trip on a curb or something like that, the better thing would be to try and like set yourself down onto your butt instead of like trying to reach down. This is the same thing with balance too. A lot of times when people are falling or they're off balance, they have more time than they realize, but the reason why they don't get to use that time in a useful way is because they panic and they freak out. And so that's one of the things that training parkour is really good for, is to try and give you the opportunity to be exposed to falling in a safe way, so that when it does happen in a more serious way, you're able to stay calm and better react to the environment. Because yeah, just reaching your arm straight back is just a knee-jerk freak out reaction, as opposed to staying calm and just being like, oh, I have enough time to actually just like fall back onto my butt, which is going to be a much like cushier supportive option than tiny little wrists.
Yeah. So falling is the first of the 4 series. What are the other 3?
Yeah, we've got vaulting, so getting over obstacles. We've got tacks and cats, so using your foot to change your direction of momentum on walls, as well as how to jump and hang on walls. And then we've got bar safety and climbing. And bar safety and climbing is like how to climb up poles, how to swing on bars, and how to dismount safely. Bars, I would say, is probably the most dangerous thing in parkour. It's also one of the more abstract, almost more gym-specific movements that we have, because you don't find a lot of bars to swing on outside of gyms. Like, you'll find branches on trees to swing on, but even that's, you know, sometimes hard to find a branch that can support you that you actually want to swing on.
Mm-hmm. And then...
So we had ukemi, vaults, tacks and cats, and then bar safety and climbing. And then Parkour Fit.
And those classes are like an hour?
Yeah.
Is there are those each a multi-class series?
Yeah, so they're an hour long, and if you come to the same like session each week, you'll get through all 4 of them, or you can try and do them like 4 days in a row.
And then the Parkour Fit, is that I'd love to know what that is, and what are the sort of like prerequisites that someone should have before like deciding to come in, like, okay, I want to learn parkour, like, am I in good enough shape to do it?
So the Parkour Fit class is like my favorite class, both because like the group of people that I've got coming to it are amazing. Like, I'm going to a park karaoke party this Saturday night with some of my students. They fell so in love with parkour, they built a little parkour gym in their basement, and so they also have a little karaoke machine, so we're gonna do some parkour and some karaoke. But the Parkour Fit class is a very scalable class, because when it comes down to it, like, I just use the word fit to get people in the door, basically. But we break down parkour into some of its like basic movements. So we work on just like some aspect of jumping, or we work on like plyometric jumps, or we basically just do parkour the way that people are exposed to normal fitness. So we do sets and reps of parkour movements. And then we, basically I scale it to wherever my students are at. So I'm constantly walking around looking at what my students are doing, looking at their movements, looking at their momentum, and trying to gauge whether or not I think they could be doing something more challenging, whether or not they need to do a different challenge so that they can focus on their body orientation differently. And so it's basically just my way of getting people to come in and move and in a parkour style of movement while also getting a workout.
Mm-hmm. And so what are like the common reasons that if somebody, like for new students, are they coming in to get in shape? Are they coming in to have more fun with the way that they like interact with fitness? Like what are the common reasons that people decide to practice?
I actually don't know the answer to that. I think that a lot of people look at it and they think, okay, that looks like fun, but I don't think I can do it, especially amongst like parents and kids. And so I have time where I'm behind the front desk, and so that's when I start making my moves on parents. I want the parents to come to my classes. And so
parents and kids.
Yeah, parents and kids. And so like while their kids are in classes, if I'm not the coach on the floor, I'll make my rounds to those parents. I'll start making jokes. I'll get in a little buddy with them, and start talking like, hey, you should give parkour a try. Why don't you feel like you can do it? And a lot of the times people don't have an actual good answer. They have a like cop-out answer. I'm too old for that. It's like the only reason why you're too old for that is because of your perception. And so that's the greatest barrier, is trying to teach people that they can perceive their body or their space differently. And once you give them the tools for that, then they go, oh, this is actually pretty cool. I enjoy this. This is fun. Like I'm getting in shape. Like I'm learning more about my body. Like these movements look cool. They feel good. And that's what it's about. It's showing people that movement feels good. Or at least that's what I think about.
What has been some of the oldest students that you've had in classes?
So my oldest consistent student I can think of, I believe he's 67 or 68. And he is a level 2 student. We have 3 levels of students at our gym, but he's a high level 2 student. He's got like a 8-foot standing jump, and he can consistently stick that on rails. He has no problem balancing up like 9 feet off the ground. He can vault, run, jump with the best of them. Like he definitely outclasses some of like my teenage students who are, years younger.
Damn, that is really inspiring. Like I have a friend who I climb with at the rock climbing gym, and she's in her 70s, and it's really it's a good reminder to always be trying something new, and to have a appreciation for the ability to learn new skills and challenge yourself through your entire life, to not have that mentality that whatever skill sets you have now will not expand beyond their present state. With the way that you teach and just your general understandings of health and fitness, I guess I really want to explore a little bit more about your education in holistic biodynamics,
biomechanics. It's okay.
I'm so sorry. Holistic biomechanics.
So traditionally speaking, biomechanics is a lot about looking at the force that the body's creating in different motions. I think it's worth mentioning that my actual bachelor's of science degree is in health studies with a secondary in exercise science. And then afterwards, there's a woman who owns a studio here in Portland called Transformation Studios, and she runs this program that she calls Holistic Biomechanics, which is sort of the implementation of a bunch of different tools like joint arthrokinematics, looking at how the joints move around each other. It deals a lot with looking at the central nervous system, so how we're integrating, processing, and refining information, and then also looks a lot at body mapping. So where is our body at in space? How do we perceive our body? And there's also an emotional anatomy aspect to it. And then it was also through that program that I started to change my approach to looking at the body, from looking at it as a musculoskeletal system into looking at it more as an elastic band system or a fascial system. If you're not familiar with fascia is sort of this elastic tissue that surrounds all of our individual muscle fibers, and then it surrounds all of those fibers as well. There's lots of different layers of this tissue that basically creates bags of tissue throughout our body, and they create these kinetic chains, is what they call them, or anatomy trains.
Yeah, with fascia, the way that I think a lot of people maybe had been exposed to it or maybe heard about it, there have been a couple different practitioners. I've first heard about it in yoga, but the teacher was a acupuncturist as well, and they were doing some work on myofascial release, where using different types of tools to help relax the tissue. Is that an application that you're familiar with or you practice with?
It's not one that I practice. It is one that I'm familiar with. In this kind of a subject, I think it's really important to, when it comes to anything about the human body, something that more people really need to acknowledge is the fact that we know very, very little actually about the body. We know more about outer space and our oceans than we do about our own actual bodies. And that's because we are these absolutely complicated, sophisticated machines that have so many different moving parts, literally billions of processes happening every single second, that allow for us to be upright, that allow for us to be having this conversation right now. And so I think it's really important that we don't necessarily take anything as the definitive all the time. We take it and we integrate that into the information that we know and that we're comfortable with, and we're constantly adapting, constantly building on top of that information. When it comes to talking about like body improvements, like chiropractic does not work for everybody. Massage therapy does not work for everybody. Rolfing, all these different like modalities of treatment. And it wouldn't be fair to say, well, it worked for this person, but it didn't work for this person, so this is not a useful tool. It's more important to look at, okay, so what's in place with these systems that it does work for this person, but it doesn't work for this person. Mm-hmm. And so I just think, a little bit of a tangent, but it's really important going into this kind of topic to recognize, because I definitely don't know everything there is to know. And if I'm wrong, I apologize. But yeah, I think it's important to be humble in your knowledge.
Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective, and that I think it's really important to share with people, because when they come to someone and they just absolutely put total trust into that person for solving maybe one thing, and then that transfers over to many things, I think it can create a perception of closed-mindedness around being open to something else that maybe could also work, maybe even work better, and then also having that understanding that it's still your responsibility to take care of yourself, not to put it totally into the hands of someone else who claims to have the answer. With your own practices around movement, have you encountered any injuries in your practice that...
Oh yeah, and so I've got a couple. So the thing that first drew me into like the holistic biomechanics stuff was I had some elbow tendonitis for a while in my left arm, and it had been really consistent for like 6 months. I remember I had been doing this photo shoot for, I think it was Nike, doing some like product demonstration to see what the new like stuff was going to look like in motion on people. And I remember I went to do this front flip, and I had accidentally over-rotated, and instead of catching myself properly with my roll here, I let my hand come into flexion, and I caught the top of my hand, and it kind of sprained my wrist and caused me some problems that lingered for longer than they should have. Also because at the time I was young and naive and not ready to go to the doctors because things cost money. And so I chose to, put that off for a really long time. And then the woman who runs transformations, she came in, she does parkour all the time. She's a strong believer in parkour for the everyday people, just because it does such a good job at getting people back into their bodies and having to be more present in space, because you can't be absent-minded while you're doing a jump in parkour, otherwise you're gonna slip. And so you have to kind of develop that moment-to-moment body interaction for parkour. But so I went to see her, and like I had been to doctors. I was seeing an an osteopath at the time as well, and the doctors took x-rays of my arms, and they were like, well, there's nothing that we can see is wrong with your arm. So as far as we know, there's nothing we can do with you. We recommend you go to like chiropractic, osteopath, give that kind of stuff and try. And nothing had really been working for me until I had went and saw Alicia, and she looks at my arm and she goes, well, from what it looks like to me is it looks like your radius is rotated and it is pulling in towards the head of your ulna. Or sorry, your radial head is pulling into your ulna. And
so the radius is, you have two large bones, the radius and ulna in your forearm. And
the radius is the one on your thumb side. If you're holding your palm up, the radius will be the one that's running thumb side. It's like radical. Mm-hmm. And your ulna is the one that's the actual elbow cap coming down towards the pinky side. And then when you rotate your hand so that it's palm down, the bones actually cross over each other to create sort of a cross brace. So you have the ability to use more force or to absorb more force. But still, when you're reaching backwards, it's a bad idea. Just as a reminder, do not foosh. Fall on outstretched hand. No fooshing.
I love that acronym.
Yeah. Had to throw it in there.
So you went to see this woman, and she had diagnosed you in that capacity.
Yeah, and so what I tended to learn from that experience is, sometimes we have injuries that can create holding patterns. As a fun little thought process right now, I just want you to think, if you were noticing this before I actually mentioned it, I want you to be aware of the shirt on your back right now, right? Were you aware of how your shirt was resting on your body? Were you thinking about it at all before I brought that to your attention?
No.
And so this is just a t-shirt. This is something that you literally put on this morning. Now, what if we take that and apply that to your body? Let's say that your body is in a position where it's stagnant, nothing's changing, so it's not actually updating any information about where that part of your body's at in space, because it no longer thinks of it as relevant. Then when I go to move, and I move my body around those parts, am I going to be moving my body with all of the information, or am I going to be blocking out information and moving less efficiently then? And so there's these little holding patterns that can build up over time that change how our body views itself in space. And so the idea of body mapping is to consciously be aware of where your structure's at in space by doing things like mentally measuring, visualizing, tracing, outlining, triangulating, recreating like relativity so that you update your body maps in your brain of where your body schema is.
And how would somebody approach kind of doing that? Would it be best... would it be most effective to have kind of like an experienced practitioner, somebody who can walk you through that process?
That definitely facilitates the process a lot faster, because there are other tools that you can use to also help along the line. And so a lot of the approach for the holistic biomechanics is to address the central nervous system. Mm-hmm. And so if we look at the nervous system, a lot of times the words people are familiar with are fight and flight or rest and digest. And what those are referring to are your autonomic nervous system, your parasympathetic and your sympathetic reflexes. And in the fight or flight, a lot of people think of it like, oh yeah, your joint spaces decrease, your non-necessary functions cease to work. So like digestion, reproduction, all of those things tend to shut down in your sympathetic nervous system.
What are the differences between those three, the autonomic and the sympathetic?
So the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system are branches of the autonomic nervous system. Mm-hmm. And then the autonomic nervous system is a part of the peripheral nervous system. So you have your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system. Your central nervous system is your brain and your spinal cord. And then your peripheral nervous system is all of the branches off of your spinal cord that communicate with the rest of your body.
Okay.
Yeah. And so
in a basic explanation.
Yeah. And so your parasympathetic nervous system, when you're in your rest and digest, you're more aware of what's happening in your environment. It's a much slower response. You're basing your interactions and your actions and how you move through space off of what's actually happening, as opposed to what you think is happening. And that's a really important distinction to make.
You're basing what is happening
instead of what you think is happening. Mm-hmm. So think about the last time.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, think about the last time you were stressed.
Okay.
Right? And when you're stressed, you're moving through space without necessarily thinking always about where you are. Like if you're preparing for...
I could totally relate to this.
Let's say you're preparing for this like
meeting that we had.
Had
a big argument with someone, and then you're walking to the grocery store and you don't remember if you locked the door.
Yeah, and it's those little things, but you're also not processing like the sounds that you're hearing in your environment, the cars passing by, the smells of the flowers. You're busy thinking about, me and this person just had this argument. I'm feeling all of these ways right now, and your awareness is not out here. You're not here. You're in your bubble. You're in your brain bubble. Mm-hmm. And when you're in that state of mind, you're moving by reflex as opposed to moving through adaptation.
And there's a utility to that, thinking about it from like a I'm trying to think about it like from a principle level. Like if you were in a dangerous environment, in a dangerous situation, like you're not thinking about like, oh, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty. You're like, I need to get away. I need to get away from this. And so that's where it's useful, but it's not useful when it's a constant thing that is happening to you, a constant process that's not related to a signal that is actually representing like danger or something to get away from. Is that like correct to say?
Yeah, and I would say another good way of looking at this is if we go back to like the 1960s, right, and we look at the top 10 like killers per year, like the top 3 are maybe stress related. Mm-hmm. If you look at the top 10 killers in the modern world, I think it's the top 6 or 7 are all stress related diseases. And the interesting thing about stress related diseases is the first 10 or so, like 10 to 15 symptoms of stress related diseases are all the same. It's only after those 10 to 15 that they actually start to delineate or to represent themselves individually.
What are some of those diseases, like the like cardiovascular?
Yeah, exactly. Cardiovascular diseases, problems with like your liver or like digestion problems, like autoimmune disorders can even be chalked up to stress related issues. Basically, any time that your body, like with autoimmune disorders, if your body isn't able to function properly, it's not able to actually process any of the like environmental things that are attacking it, it starts to shut down, and you run into a system that's no longer functioning off of. Gosh, I'm explaining this really poorly. Sorry, I got ahead of myself.
What are like you had mentioned that like they share a lot of the same symptoms. So like, what would be some of those symptoms that they?
Fatigue, anxiety, dehydration. We've got.
Depression's got to be.
Yeah, depression, but like depression is also like another beast in and of itself. It's they're usually just those like I'm tired, I don't have an appetite, I sleep irregularly, I'm waking up all the time, I've got problems with like anxiety or depression. There's all of these just like they don't really distinguish like until your liver starts to shut down or until.
Oh, and then you're like, oh, wait, I'm not getting enough sleep. I am upset all the time. I am not like having a fulfilling relationship with so and so.
Well, but see,
like
nobody really addresses it that way, and so that's part of it though. Is like a lot of these things are also just because of the way that we run our society now. Mm-hmm. People aren't allowed to have like as much freedom of expression. Everybody like working in offices or cubicles, they're trying to fit into a specific model of, you know, who they're supposed to be, as opposed to having the freedom to kind of express themselves. And some environments do a better job at that than others. But you know, if
environments that allow for freedom of movement, for example.
Yeah, but like, or if we take our educational systems into consideration, right? Our educational systems are outdated because the way that we teach people now was all about breeding basically factory workers, right? We're giving them information, we want them to receive the information we're giving them, and then we want them to regurgitate that information back to us. It's called the banking method of education. And so you deposit little pieces of information, and then you withdraw those pieces of information. And it's really useful for creating a working class of people who can listen to what you're saying and give you the result that you're looking for. But we need more critical thinkers now. We live in a different kind of environment. We're not working in a factory, like a lineup or an assembly line. That's what I'm looking for. We deal a lot more with situations that are changing very drastically moment to moment, very like critical, like things that require critical thinking, adaptation, creative thinking. Right? Yeah. And so yeah, we even in the way that we are educating people, start to push them into these boxes.
And does a lot of the subject matter kind of fall under the materials that are like taught within holistic biomechanics? Or
So yeah, it's complicated. So I would say the emotional anatomy side of things is something that we did discuss in the training.
Emotional anatomy.
Yeah, and that's actually that is a book in and of itself, the emotional anatomy. And in emotional anatomy, they have a different representation for like the fight or flight response. And so where we think of it as fight or flight, they think of it as like an initial startle phase, followed by fight, flight, and freeze. And these are all sort of our adrenaline phases, or our what's the word I'm looking for? Our gosh, I can't remember the word off the top of my head. It's fine. But yeah, they're basically where adrenaline's being released. They're and then we have our collapse 2, and rigor. And so these sort of are your cortisol releasing phases, where your energy levels start to decrease. And so let's just start from the beginning. Startle is like you hear a loud noise. If I were to slam on this table, somebody probably somewhere would jump. You're going to increase your awareness of your environment. Your senses will be heightened, but then you're going to make a judgment. Am I safe? Yeah, I feel safe. Okay. Then you no longer are startled. We probably go in and out of startle, thousands of times a day. We make that decision of, do I feel safe right now or do I not feel safe? And then depending on who you are, your environmental exposure, you will either go into fight, flight, or freeze. And fight is often associated with like standing your ground. Flight is often associated with retreat, and freeze is often associated with like anxiety or panic attacks where you don't have the ability to do anything other than stay still. This is an active stage because in order to appear dead, you actually have to contract all of your muscles maximally, and so it's a very exhausting stage to be in. And then afterwards, you go into collapse, which is where your internal pressure is sort of decreased so much that your body kind of slumps in on itself. And there are observable postures related to each of these like emotional anatomy aspects, or these like stress related postures that you can observe in people. Because in fight, people tend to pull their shoulders back, shorten their joint levers. And in flight, you tend to see a lot of twisting in people. And so, like, people who develop scoliosis over time might potentially be in their flight response a lot, feeling like they have to pull away or flee. And you can see this sometimes in conversations. Like, I remember an instance where I was just talking with somebody and I was literally explaining all of this material, but I was also on kind of a time crunch. And so as I explained the material to them, the distance between me and them started to increase. I started to create more space between the two of us because I needed to
physically or in a perceptive way?
No, like literally physically, like because I was standing up and I was talking to this person explaining this while they were sitting down, and the distance slowly became kind of wide. Like I started like 3 feet away from this person, and while I'm still explaining these things, I found myself like 10 feet away from this person still explaining it. And it was funny because they called me out on it. And I was like, you know what? That's actually a really good example. I've been thinking about the fact that I need to go because I'm on a time constraint. Like I'm already like 15 minutes behind now because we've been having this conversation. And so I was kind of actively removing myself from it without realizing it.
And so to make sure that I'm still like understanding, having the understanding of these different states, is actually having the understanding of these states and how they are represented in our being the useful like takeaway from this discussion?
I would say it's useful as a coach in order to observe that in other people.
To first identify where another person exists or spends time, and maybe this is related to the causal factor that you are then trying to address?
In terms of the way that we interact with each other, or it might also be something that, like, because you have these holding patterns, or this kind of twisting, or these, like, minimized joint levers, we have to look at your tissue and go, okay, well, we need to address this. Because it's going to lead to a potential for injury. And so being able to recognize how people's bodies are resting in space differently, and to be able to recognize, like, if I'm giving somebody a challenge that makes them like go into one of these states as well.
In parkour.
Yeah, a challenge in parkour. Like as a parkour coach, it's really useful. But even like your average Joe off the street, like they have they have their own different associations, their own problems that they come in with, and you know, we all wear our baggage on our shoulders. You know, they say everybody has their own baggage, and so we have to kind of get to the point where we can let go of our baggage a little bit more in order to let our bodies be fully healthy, fully expressive, because like that's also something that's really abstract. But yeah, if you spend all of your time thinking about things that have happened in the past, again, just like in that instance where you're walking after that argument with whoever, you're not taking in the environment, and things start to go a lot faster because nothing's changing. And so time will pass you by, the environment will pass you by. You're going to feel like everything's going by really fast, as opposed to being in the moment.
And so what is a way to get back to the moment?
Yes, and so we talked about a little bit of this earlier. You asked the question about body mapping. And the reason why some of this is really important is because once you start to recognize that you're in those stress responses, things change pretty quickly. Like a good example would be, I'm sure you've been working on your computer before, and your shoulders are hiked up, and then as soon as you notice that your shoulders are that way, they kind of just sort of settle down. Mm-hmm. And so there are times where like that's a really like exaggerated example, but if you create that awareness of your body as it moves through space over time, significant change can occur. So if you think about a baby, you don't tell a baby how to stand or a baby how to walk. A baby looks at other people and it experiments, it feels in its body what it's like to try and create that balance point. And over time, with enough attempts, with enough repetition, with enough sensory input, it gets to that point where it can stand on its own 2 feet. And there are some tribes in Africa where they literally yank on the kids' legs and like pull at their feet and stimulate their feet a lot, and you end up with these kids who are walking a lot faster than, you know, some of their non-tribal like compatriots. And so it's an interesting thing where sensory information creates change in movement. And that's what we need to get people to do, is to have that kind of input, to have that kind of intention-based movement, that critical thinking about their movement. And it can't be something that's too conscious, because if you're trying to force it, then it's not going to be something that's adaptive. It's going to be something that's controlled. And so this is where it gets into that abstract with body mapping. Body mapping, the question that you should be asking is, where is my body at in space? Because where isn't trying to put my body into a position, where isn't trying to tell my body what it should be doing, where is an observation? And so that's the thing that people need to start doing more, is they need to make observations about where their body is in space.
And is that at any time during the day?
That could be laying down on the ground or in movement. And I would recommend for people at first to try this, just laying down on the ground. A good place to start would be like with your shoulders. You can ask, where are my shoulders at in space compared to my spine? What is the distance between my spine and my shoulder blade? Compare your left and your right side. Do they both have equal distance, or does one have more width? Are both of your shoulders equally high up on your back, or do they feel, you know, differently heighted? How much pressure from your rib cage can you feel on the floor beneath you? And you start asking yourself these kinds of questions. But I would recommend that you spend at least like 90 seconds or more focusing, or not focusing, but observing, creating that awareness of those structures for at least, again, 90 seconds or more, because it takes time to send a signal down to your body and back up to your brain. Mm-hmm. It sends time for those loops to happen. And that's why it's really nice if you're in like an emergency situation to go into that sympathetic, that fight or flight response, because it's reflexive. You're not going to have to think as much about what you're doing. It's going to be much more reflexive. Whereas if you want to think about actions, you have to have intention. It takes time to plan that movement. And so
can you train those systems and that sensory? Because actually, you know, what you were just talking about, it just made me think back to, it was in the spring of last year, I attended a workshop hosted by movement teacher. People in the movement space are familiar with, or anybody who uses the word movement. So it was hosted by Ido Portal, and we were doing this one exercise where he had us work in partners, and partner A, like say that's yourself, would close their eyes, and partner B would take their finger and touch you somewhere around your face. And Ido made a joke where he said, okay, we have to do it in this PC way because we're in the United States, but if we were in Russia, I would use a needle. Because the idea was to train someone in their speed of reaction. And what you were talking about with like the fight and flight response, like if somebody's going to stick you with a needle, what are you going to do? Like automatically you would want to be pulling away from that, right? But what Ito discovered through doing this practice with a lot of people is that their signals were crossed. And he was trying to figure out ways, because it's like we were taking a workshop from him, but he was still using us as like research subjects. He would see that people, even when they would be poked by someone, sometimes would react towards the stimulus and move towards it. Whereas if it actually was a needle, they would be moving away. You wouldn't go towards it. And so he was really trying to figure out a way to train people to not only move quickly, because the exercise was oriented around speed, but I think now, based on the explanation that you were just kind of like sharing, it seems as though it was also a exercise in reacquainting ourselves with this like fight and flight response. Does that sound?
I mean, I could definitely see. I can definitely see that. Mm-hmm. The thing I would say is another way you could practice like a similar exercise to that would be to like have somebody touch a part of your body, and then for you to try and touch the same point of your body to see how accurate your body maps are, basically. Mm-hmm.
Because in this exercise, too, you didn't know when the partner was going to touch you.
Yeah, or where.
And you would just start to build up a lot of tension, like not knowing, but just trying to be ready, And then what would happen when you actually did get touched? That was the interesting thing, because he didn't say it at first. He's like, I saw some of you guys move towards it. He said it after the fact.
And so you're saying, like, as you guys were waiting, you were moving towards where you expected the stimulus? Or
I'm sorry.
As soon as the stimulus came, you moved towards it?
After the stimulus came, how did you respond?
And you guys were just using your fingers, though, right?
We're just using your finger, yeah.
Because, like, with a needle, for example, even if, like, you guys had used, like, your fingertip, you probably would have gotten, like, a different response if you, instead of using just your finger. But, like, with, like, a needle, it's going to send a different signal to the tissue, because it's literally piercing the skin. It's going to pierce the tissue of the fascia. And so when it comes
more precise signal, right?
When it comes to like that kind of reaction, normally when it like a knee-jerk reaction that we're pulling away from, our fascia is the thing that's communicating that we need to pull away. It's not necessarily a conscious thought. It's literally the tissue sends a reaction, and it slides and it changes our whole physical structure. So
and that's coded into us.
That's coded into us.
Okay, I'm just a more basic example that I think a lot of people could relate to. Imagine seeing an iron, and if you've ever touched an iron that's hot, what do? You move your finger away. If the stove is hot, you move your finger away.
But you don't notice the sensation of the pain until moments after.
Yeah.
And this is true for like injuries too. You know, you can see an injury before you start to feel an injury, and oftentimes that is the case. You see it and you go, oh, well, and then you're like, okay, now this hurts.
Yeah. Man, lots of nuggets to dig into there. Really interesting subject matter. And so this is how do you incorporate this into the way that you teach, or it's just part of you as who you are as a teacher?
Sort of. And so that's the part where it gets really hard. So one of the most common things that we see in injuries in parkour are like knee injuries or like ankle sprains, and particularly when it comes to knee injuries in parkour, we have a problem with quad dominant movement. People using their quadriceps more to do pretty much every action, as opposed to using their posterior chain to assist in things like absorption and jumping and loading. And so when you overuse your quads, you tend to pull your kneecap up your leg, and the quadriceps and the hamstrings are like agonist-antagonistic muscles. So when one is in contraction, the other one's in stretch, and vice versa. And so if you're maximally contracting your quadriceps, you're not leaving any room for you to contract your hamstrings, or vice versa. And so this can leave some instability at the knee joint. There's lots of other muscles around the knee joint too that also go into play a factor, but like really we have like the quad dominance is particularly the issue within parkour.
And so you're working with your students to help them better understand how to utilize their entire
yeah. And so what we end up seeing is we see a lot of knee squats where your knees are going out super far forward, as opposed to like a hinge squat where you first hinge at the hips before you sink into your squat, which tends to load the weight more like over your feet and into your like glutes and hamstrings, as opposed to a knee dominant squat, which tends to put more of the weight forward in your body and more into the knee itself. And so that's one of the things that has to be addressed more often in parkour, is, you know, landing and loading properly, because most people don't know how to move their hips. And so that's the thing that I would say I have to teach more often than anything, is trying to get people to learn how to mobilize their hips around their spine as opposed to mobilizing their spine around their hips, because our spine has all of this really important information that's running through it. We have all these nerves and all these like blood vessels and arteries, veins that are running through, and if you change the shape of your spine, you're also at some point going to be compressing all of these really important tubes that are traveling through there. Whereas if you move your hips and your shoulders around your spine can stay in pretty much the same position. I was taught to view the vertebral column as the coordinated vertebral column, the CVC, meaning that it pretty much maintains the exact same S shape no matter what movement you're doing. And so like when you go into your arch and your curl, it's my hips and my shoulders. I'm not moving my spine. I'm not changing my lumbar. And so that's another thing that, you know, teaching people to not move their spine as much. Like, people do sit-ups are bad for you just because you're crunching. Your abdominal muscles are meant to stabilize your core. Your core muscles are meant to stabilize your spine in its vertical position. You're not supposed to be contorting it around a whole lot. Like, you have maybe like 1-ish degree of like motion at each individual like spinal vertebra.
Lots of wisdom dropping today, Mr. Niko Pal.
But see, here's the thing: is like, that's also like, as a fitness professional, that's my opinion in terms of how to do the squat, in terms of how the body should be moving. I know for a fact that there are other people out there who are going to say, yeah, but then what happens when you load like back squat or front squat? And I would say, well, I don't load back squat or front squat with my athletes. If I'm going to load a squat with my athletes, I do like a goblet squat. Or like a front squat down to half squat, because if we're thinking about the spine staying coordinated, let's say I'm loading the weight up on my back. Now that I've got my barbell on the back, this is going to push my body into an arch. And if I want my hips and my shoulders to be coordinating, I can only go down about, just over a quarter of the way, almost to a half squat, before my tail is going to start tucking underneath my spine. And once my tail starts to tuck, my shoulders are going to be in an arch, but my hips are going to start pulling into a curl. And so I end up with discoordinated movement along my spinal column. And so the whole focus of like the holistic biomechanics is to try and keep the body moving in coordination, because when the body's moving in coordination, it's moving in an elastic manner. It means the tissues can slide in order to create motion instead of having to contract as much to create motion.
How would someone know whether or not they are moving in a coordinated versus uncoordinated fashion? So
body mapping is one of those things that helps. And so you also asked a question earlier, like, do you get better at those things when you do something like body mapping more? And the answer is absolutely. Anything you do, you get better at. And the one thing particularly with body mapping is when you use a nerve pathway in your body will start to reinforce that nerve pathway. So when you do something a bunch of times, like I've probably done this hand motion a bajillion times in my life, and so I started to myelinate the pathway that information travels. And what that means is I add this like fatty substance that insulates the nerve tissue so that when I send a signal, it can get there faster. Instead of just, taking the normal pathway, I've now got my insulated pathway, which can allow for like up to, I can't even remember, like 200 times faster depending on how myelinated the like individual nerve is. It's an exponential increase over what a standard non-myelinated nerve would be.
And this is a useful practice for somebody who's working on something that's very specific in regards to like skill, whether it's like a jump or a handstand or
and so body mapping can help facilitate that process. Just by doing those things, you're already building up those pathways. It's just by adding in additional information, you create the potential for change more quickly.
Do you do you in your teaching use any sort of visualization practice with your athletes?
Not really. So I often ask my students, where is your body? So like if they're trying to connect a couple of movements, I'll ask like, where is your body at? Like, where's your chest compared to your hips? Mm-hmm. Is your chest out in front of you, or is it behind you right now? How is that changing your momentum? And so I've been trying more lately to give my students cues to analyze where their structure is in space, instead of, like I said earlier, I don't want to try to give them all the answers. I still want there to be a level of discovery. It's just I'm trying to facilitate them in that direction. And so instead of being like, this is where your chest needs to be, try it with your chest in front of you, try it with your chest behind you, notice how that changes the movement. And so then instead of being able to just go straight to the answer, they have to discover what feels better for them. And
what makes the movement more effective or efficient? Yeah,
and so I don't usually go as like small as body mapping can be. Like body mapping could literally be like noticing the tip of your patella, like the bottom tip of your patella and the top of your shin bone, noticing the distance between those two things and how that changes over time. And so like that's a really hard awareness for some people. Another good one would be like your chin to the top of your breastbone. This is an easy way that you could tell whether or not you're changing the shape of your spine a lot. Because if I curl from my spine, the distance between my chin and my breastbone would change a lot. Whereas if I curl from my shoulders, the distance, like if I'm arching and curling here, the distance between my chin and my breastbone is always staying constant, as opposed to changing and compressing.
Fascinating. I love it, because I'm starting to think now there's been times where, whether it's been like in yoga classes or in seminars that I've attended around, like calisthenics, body weight, or gymnastics, or handstands, oftentimes I feel that teachers have given cues that have maybe helped me orient myself in space, and certain cues I've found to be sometimes more useful than others. I think with something like handstands, which I've practiced for a couple of years, there's always if I've had a good teacher, like I remember now a workshop I took with a hand balancer, Yuval Ayalon, and a lot of the teaching that he had was oriented around understanding the relationship between how your wrist was in relation to your elbow, in relation to your shoulders, in relation to your hips, in relation to your ankles, in relation to your toes, because all of those different like joints, now that I think about it, and well, your toes not a joint exactly, but actually no, your toes do have joints, would be then cues that Yuval would have around point your toes, lock your knees, like tilt your hips or in a more anterior way or a posterior way, open your shoulders versus close your shoulders. So definitely feels very much oriented around that body mapping like practice that you were just explaining.
So there is like that does make me think about like posture though, for example. Mm-hmm. Posture is one of those really interesting things where there is quote unquote good posture and there's societal posture. And societal posture is what we tell people posture is supposed to look like, right? Lift your chin up, pull your shoulders back, squeeze your butt cheeks, like look real proper. And the problem with that is if we're always telling people how to rest their body, then they're never actually using their internal systems to gauge how their structure should be in space. And so that's again why I also prefer not to tell people like the exact answer, like tilt your hips or, use your shoulders in this specific way, because then they're going to be trying to meet the expectations of movement that I set for them, as opposed to moving with what their body feels like. Mm-hmm. And so it's just one of those little abstracts, and again, different strokes for different blokes. And so it's just one of those things like posture, for example, again, going back to our example of a baby, you didn't tell the baby how to have posture. If I were to yell at a baby and tell him that he needs to pull his shoulders back, the baby would just look at me with a blank face. Eventually he gets there. Babies have some of the cleanest, healthiest movement that you'll see in most cases. It's not until they start to like get old enough and start mapping how their parents move through space, or relatives, whoever's around them,
Sitting
that they
in a lot
start
of
to
chairs.
playing on their iPads these days. These kids. Yeah, and so we are unfortunately told specifically how to do a lot of things, even how to breathe, right? This is the specific way you need to breathe, instead of just bringing our awareness back into our body and having the intention to observe our breath. This is a good challenge for you guys. Lay on the floor, close your eyes, let your hands rest down by your side, and notice the pressure of your rib cage into the ground. And you're going to spend some time here, and I just want you to breathe. And as you breathe, notice how your rib cage expands and contracts. Notice if your body expands more out in front of you, or if it expands more out to the side of you. Doesn't matter what it's doing. Either way is fine. You're just trying to create an awareness and observation, and notice if anything about your breath changes. Maybe the length of your breath changes, it becomes shorter, it might become longer. Maybe your ribs no longer expand forward, they start to go out to the side more, or vice versa. Just gather some information about how you're breathing, and allow yourself to breathe however the heck you want, without any other input. Just whatever happens. And then take that even further. You can then continue, if you're feeling it, go into your body, take your shoulders, sense the width of your shoulders. Notice if you have more weight of your shoulders into the ground or more weight of your rib cage. Again, I'm not going to give you an answer. I just want you to observe. Notice if anything changes. Maybe you feel something change in your legs or in your arms. Just notice. Be in your body. Take some time.
I didn't know the conversation today would go here, but I love it, and I want to leave it at that. I think that's a great place for anybody who's tuned in or who is listening right now to have something tangible to take away and actually practice. Niko, for people who want to learn more about parkour, who want to learn more about holistic biomechanics, who want to learn more about learning from you, where should they go? Online, offline? What's the best way to go about that?
So I pretty much live at the gym where I work, Forge Parkour. It's over in Southeast Portland by Mall 205.
ForgeParkour.com.
Yep, exactly. And if you want to get a hold of me, you can actually email me at Niko@ForgeParkour.com. That's Niko at ForgeParkour.com. It's a mouthful.
Awesome. And one last thing, too, I wanted to bring up. Recently, you were in Scotland. You were giving a presentation about some of the subject matter that you talked about today, right? Is there anywhere to see that or listen to that?
So, unfortunately, the Art of Retreat, they don't usually film those just because the formats are really hard to film. It is oftentimes like a setup like this, but with much larger people. I will tell you, it was really fun. Right before I gave my presentation in Scotland, though, I spilled my water bottle all over my pants, and it's really great because the specifics of my presentation were stress and processing, basically how we integrate motor patterns. And so since stress was like the buzzword that I used to try and get people in, everybody was just giving me a hard time for spilling water all over my pants, and it was great.
Awesome. I love it. Awesome. Niko, any lasting words of wisdom or anything that you'd love to leave with the audience today?
I would say, we oftentimes spend a lot of time trying to fit into the forms that other people tell us to, and that it's really important to just allow for yourself to be yourself sometimes. And if you don't know what that means, then that's definitely the perfect time for you to start to bring your awareness back into your body. Bringing your awareness into your body doesn't mean not engaging with the external environment. It means engaging with the external environment and your internal environment simultaneously to create that kind of harmony in space. Because if you spend all your time stuck in your head, you're going to miss all of the beautiful things that are going to pass you by. Like right now, we're very fortunate to be looking out a nice window. We got some nice sunny days and nature ahead of us. Appreciate what you have, and when you're in the moment, it's easier to do that.
Excellent. Couldn't agree more, and thank you so much for dropping so much wisdom with it on us today. And I hope we get outside actually like in the next couple minutes. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you everybody who's tuned in today, and I'm gonna go turn off the live stream. Niko, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.